Joel Makower, welcome back to Sustainable Nation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Josh.
Great to have you on again. A lot to talk about. And first, for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, the history of GreenBiz and Trellis Group, and the role that they and you play in the world of corporate sustainability?
Okay, I'll try to keep that short. So I'm a journalist by training. I've been in the writing about and speaking about the field of sustainable business since the late 80s. I think I was a brunette back then. I'm the co-founder of the company that was originally called GreenBiz Group and now called Trellis Group. We're a media and events company based here in Oakland, California. We do three things. We have events, two events every year, sort of in the 2,000 to 3,000 person kind of size. One's called GreenBiz, which is in the winter. It's been in Phoenix. It's this year. Next year in 27, it's moving to San Diego. And then Trellis Impact, which is coming up, I think, not too long from now in the third week of June in San Francisco. That's more on the GreenBiz is more about the profession of sustainability, and Trellis Impact is a little bit more on the implementation side around energy and water waste and circularity and finance and a lot of those pieces. So that's the gist of where I'm coming from. Yeah, I've written books. I don't commit as much journalism now these days as I used to, but I still love doing that, and I just love this field.
Excellent. I enjoyed GreenBiz as always this year. Another great event. I know a lot of our listeners from larger companies probably been to a few of those, are familiar with your work. But excited to jump in and just get your thoughts on where the industry is at today. You've watched corporate sustainability, this field evolve for many years. When you look at 2026, where we're at now, where would you say the industry is at now?
Well, it's always, I have a podcast, as you know, called Two Steps Forward, and it's sort of, two steps forward, one step back, or as I call it, the sustainable business cha-cha. It's always been a slog. It's never been easy. Sustainability professionals have always swum upstream in their organizations, sometimes in their families and communities. The industry's gone through a number of waves, up waves and down waves. We're obviously, I don't think anyone's going to be shocked to hear that we're in a down wave right now with between the political uncertainty and the economic uncertainty and the political pushback, maybe political uncertainty as well. But it's a tough time, and this isn't going away. Last month, we published our biennial state of the sustainability profession report, and it found that there's two steps forward, one step back. Over in the 2 years since the previous report in 2024, almost half of the companies, and there's I think about 1,000 respondents to this. About 500 firms with $1 billion plus revenue. Almost half have increased their sustainability headcount, and a quarter have cut them. About a little over half, 57%, have maintained their sustainability targets. 24% have strengthened them, and 16% have stepped back, weakened, or abandoned them altogether. So, it's a challenging time, but what's remarkable is that this hasn't gone away. The resilience of the profession continues. Yes, smaller teams, maybe smaller budgets, scrappier, but and then we can get into where they're reporting now versus a couple of years ago, and the CEO buy-in and all kinds of pieces of this. By the way, this State of Sustainability Profession report is a free download from trellis.net, so you can just go grab it there, and it's pretty interesting. I'm always fascinated, and I live and breathe this profession, and I always learn so much.
Yeah, great. Definitely recommend everyone check that out. Love going through that every year when that's published. The reduction in sustainability teams and budgets, what do you think are the main drivers of that? Is it the political backlash, the what's happening in that space, or is it cost savings? Is it companies hearing from stakeholders like investors or customers that sustainability is not as important as it once was? What do you think are the main drivers in this?
Well, I think the answer is yes. It starts with the political pushback, with this political moment that we've been going through. Companies have been punished by the political establishment, by the Trump administration, for being proactive, being outspoken on climate and sustainability, biodiversity, and it was derided as woke and all of that. So companies have wanted to keep their head down. So they're the I think that in some ways you can sum up where we are with the title of this year's the State of the Profession report. Says saying less but doing more, advancing sustainability in stormy times. There's the demand hasn't gone away. The problems certainly haven't gone away. So it's really the willingness of CEOs and boards, or C-suite and boards of directors, to want to step up and in some cases, defy the political winds and say, no, this is important. This is not political. This is about business. This is about resilience. This is about risk. This is about opportunity. And that's, I think, the interesting dynamic going on right now in this moment. The demand for products and services, maybe not so much on the consumer side, hasn't grown a lot. I don't know that it's shrunk much, but consumers are facing tough times. As we're having this conversation, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and oil prices are still hovering, give or take around $100 a barrel, and and that's probably going to not change for much for a while. So, consumers are pressed, and except for the privileged, sort of elite at the high end, they're really probably staying away from anything that's premium price. So that's a challenge. But operationally, inside companies and their supply chains and their energy and use and water use and toxics and carbon emissions and waste streams and facility management and real estate and finance. I mean, those are all still engaged. They're still leaning into this stuff pretty much as they ever have.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned that the name of the report, saying less but doing more. I think a lot of us have been hearing that. There's been research out. Companies are pulling back on their sustainability language, even though they continue to do the work. So green hushing is what people are calling this. Is green hushing, you think, a responsible response to this moment, or does it kind of weaken accountability in any way? And do you think this changes when the political climate changes, when maybe the midterms happen and we see a change in government a little, or the next administration? Do you think that changes the headwinds here?
Well, first of all, I think the surprising part of the title of saying less but doing more is the doing more part, which I think is really sort of the counterintuitive piece, because you don't hear a lot about it, the green hushing, as you call it. You assume that companies have just given up, or they're just doing a lot less, and that's just not true. There's a great report that came out of a firm called Futera out of the UK, and written by my podcast co-host Solitaire Townsend, on waves. And we've gone through these up waves and down waves, as I was saying earlier, and they're predicting that based on the trends we've seen over the past 30 or more years, that sometime around the end of this year, beginning of next year, Q4 26 or Q5 20, it's going to be Q1 27.
If only.
We haven't gotten to Q5 yet. That we'll start to see this upwave. And just because, again, the problems aren't going away, the pressures on companies to reduce their risk and improve their resilience is only going to get increased, particularly as we see, you're talking about a El Nino from hell coming at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And so more floods, more droughts, more everything. There's going to be just more pressure to do something about this. And yeah, politically, will the midterms change that? Maybe a little bit. I don't know. And that's, of course, just in the United States. But I think that what's continues to be really exciting and fascinating and hopeful is that companies are still doing the work. And so, is it bad that they're not talking about it? It's not great, but I don't know that it's a major problem. It would be better if they could talk about it, because the more they do, the more people see that this is important, that this is mainstream, this is not just a nice to do. But we're not. But in lieu of that, or in spite of that, the work continues. And when they do come out of that, whenever that is, whether it's Q1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, I think companies will have a lot of great stories to tell.
Yeah, and do you think any of that leads to the sustainability employee becoming irrelevant in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you know, at GreenBiz 26, back in February, we had a debate on stage, an hour-long debate, Oxford-style debate on is the sustainability professional irrelevant? And it's sort of an odd thing to do in front of a room full of a couple thousand sustainability professionals, but it was a provocation that we wanted to have, because it's an important question to ask. And I'm pretty, and the state of the room was, absolutely not. It's not irrelevant. Question, but it's changing. The problems, as I said, aren't going away, but the profession is changing. It's getting more embedded in finance and supply chain and other parts of the company. Legal, because so much of it is compliance oriented, particularly with European regulations, not so much in the U.S. anymore. But it's somebody's got to be looking at this stuff, and it's funny because there's this old trope in the sustainability profession among chief sustainability officer types that my goal is to work myself out of a job. And the point being that at some point you won't need, it's really like safety, and you don't.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time with quality. I mean, remember back in the 80s, total quality management, and everyone was talking about quality, and everyone was a quality professional, and there were 1,000 conferences and publications on total quality management. Something that was Edward Deming's, brought from the Japanese. You don't hear about quality anymore. It hasn't gone away. Quality is still a hugely important and mission critical piece of pretty much every company, and particularly if you're manufacturing anything. But it's just become embedded. Same with safety. And so it's just an expectation. So the challenge and the opportunity is, how does sustainability become an expectation, and not necessarily some bright shiny object that companies need to shout from the rooftops, let alone stick their, just sorry to mix metaphors here, but stick their heads above the parapets and get whacked at by the haters and the deniers and the incumbent interests who don't want to see this succeed, because they have, their paychecks are based on sustainability sort of failing
Mm-hmm.
or fading away.
Right. And, with these increasing regulations and this kind of work becoming more compliance driven, is there a threat, or are you seeing it anywhere where this work is becoming strictly about compliance, and that's might stop us from sustainability innovation in the future?
Well, compliance isn't I'm so sorry. So compliance isn't just about minimizing wastewater discharge or emissions. It's also about product safety and honesty and ethics in marketplaces. And there's a number of other pieces of this. So yes, regulations are the bare minimum. I like to talk about given regulation. If you did any less, it would be illegal. And so that's not the goal necessarily, to just do what's, what the law requires, because the law usually doesn't require a lot in terms of how we get to where we need in terms of, greenhouse gas emissions and solving water and biodiversity crises and all these other things that we're dealing with. But regulations, are getting stricter in Europe, although they have some setbacks. And certainly large companies in North America, their markets are global, including in Europe. So that's becoming the default. California, where I live, is also continues to play a role, as much as it has with greenhouse gas emissions and tailpipe emissions and a number of other things. So, but there's also the marketplace. The marketplace is a regulator in with the broadest sense, and the marketplace is looking, the customers, particularly B2B customers, not so much consumers, are looking for companies that are going to, first of all, be leaders, that second, align with their values, but equally important, are not going to cause risks, whether they're material risks or regulatory risks or reputational risks or financial risks, among other types of risks that they as customers might face by doing business with this company over here. And so those are regulations too, at least in the broad sense.
Yeah, great points. Moving on to the state of the sustainability profession. You mentioned that report recently came out, discusses how, companies again are mostly staying the course, but many professionals are starting to kind of feel less fulfilled. What do you think explains that disconnect, and what's happening in that dynamic?
Well, it's hard. It's a hard time to be a sustainability professional. We've sort of come not full circle, but when I started off in this, sustainability it wasn't even called that then. It was environmental responsibility or corporate social responsibility or just environmental compliance was kind of marginalized. It was sort of sat off to the side. It wasn't seen as core to the business of productivity and profits. And increasingly, it became an expectation, a societal expectation, a customer expectation, in some cases, a regulatory expectation, and it became much more embedded. But now it's sort of retreating back to being, sort of on the margins again, and it's not seen as core. And I think that's short-sighted on the part of companies who are going down that path. And it's certainly not all companies. I think it's the minority of companies who are marginalizing it. In the report, interesting part is the CEO engagement. So as part of the survey that I mentioned is, how involved is your CEO in your organization's sustainability program? And 2 years ago in 2024, almost half, 48%, said they own it. They're very engaged. That's now down to 32%. So it's dropped by a third. The interested but not a priority has grown slightly. So this, it starts at the top. That and is also that company sustainability spending tracks that engagement. There's a great chart I'm looking at now on the report that said that you see these downward lines that starting in 2022. So this is not just related to the second Trump administration, but that CEO engagement started dropping, and so did budgets. So, it's a challenging time to be doing this kind of work. But what's also interesting, the flip side of that, I guess, Josh, is that there continues to be resolve. There's frustration and resolve. There's a great line in the report written by John Davies, who runs the networks and leads the networks at Trellis Group and leads this report. He said, irritation can turn sand into pearls, and pressure can turn coal into diamonds. And so I think to a large extent that, dealing with that irritation and pressure is motivating. a lot of sustainability professionals to lean in, to make those cases better, to really align much more with business metrics, and the things that companies and Wall Street, not coincidentally, care about, around sales and profitability, but also some of the intangibles around risk mitigation and reputation. But to the extent that sustainability professionals are aligning with what investors care about, and not just so-called socially responsible investors, that's where I think sustainability continues to flourish, or at least be stable, if not flourishing. And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity for sustainability professionals is, how do you better align with traditional business metrics? It seems like that should have been something that was taking place all along, but it's relatively new, at least for a lot of companies. Some companies have been doing it for a while, but most, I would say, haven't. And that's directly the result of this challenging moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something everyone in this industry has been preaching for a very long time, tying your sustainability to your business objectives, and now it just seems like that's an absolute necessity to get a lot of this done. Anything that outside of a CEO leadership, budget, maybe availability, are there anything that you see different, separating, these sustainability leaders who are really thriving right now, from those who might be feeling stuck or burnt out? Any other differences in the companies?
I think to the extent there are, it has a lot to do with the companies changing strategy, changing senior management. I think there's a quote from someone in here who said this: they're in their third CEO in like 5 years, and the first one cared a lot, the first one didn't care so much, the second one cared a lot, and the third one doesn't care at all about sustainability. And so I think this is not new to the last few years, but sustainability professionals have always had to sort of operate with a neck brace, because you're getting whiplashed in one way or the other. That continues as the shelf life of a CEO continues to shrink. What is it, 5, 6, 7, 8 years now? And so that is hard, because every CEO come in and wants to make his or her mark and set new goals and decide what's important, what is less important, maybe look at what investors are saying right now. That's probably had a lot to do with why there's a new CEO in the first place. So that doesn't help anybody in business when strategy is changing, when priorities are changing, when CEO management is changing, and of course when budgets are changing. And I think getting back to some level of stability, which I believe will happen again in this upwave that we expect within a year, will solve some of that. But I can say that when we do come out of this, or start to come out of this, because it'll be probably a long climb back up, that sustainability professionals are not just going to go back to the way things always were. They've been chastened, they've been smarter, they've become a lot more entrepreneurial, I guess, in terms of getting to know and dealing with finance, with legal, with risk management teams, and to some extent operations or marcom, supply chain, and to really embedding themselves more within the company, which is what sustainability should have always been. It should be part of the fabric of sustainability. You don't do anything in business without finance and looking at the numbers and rolling those back up to finance. And if it's not going well, then you do something about it. And I think the CSO types are starting to recognize that they have to be much more accountable in some very hardcore ways. And that's tough, because so many of the things that we do are in companies is longer term, intangible, at least in the short term, And that bumps up against the realities of short-termism inside companies, and so I think, it'll be really interesting. I don't have the answer. I can't predict how it's going to be, but I do know it's already, people are in the profession are already changing how they show up, and that's only going to continue. And I think as a result, they're going to come out of this in a much stronger position.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Going through tough times to sharpen skills and come out better. That's great to hear.
Josh, we talk about resilience a lot for companies.
Mhm.
Resilience is the ability to take a shock and come back, quickly. I think there's a lot of resilience in the profession as well. That how do you take these hits that professionals have been taking and come back and quickly. And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. One of the great stories of probably 2027 and 2028.
Fantastic. Great to hear. Wanted to touch on net zero targets quickly. A lot of talk around that. A few years ago, net zero targets were everywhere. Companies are now starting, 2030. A lot of them have 2030 targets, and that's coming up soon. Companies are revising, weakening, sometimes abandoning targets. I'm wondering if you think, what do you think about all this? Were the original targets too ambitious? Poorly designed? Were they not backed by, real transition plans? What do you think about these companies coming up on 2030 targets, and those companies that are maybe pulling back or revising?
Yeah, well, all of the above, Josh. I mean, if you put this in context, after the Paris Climate Accords in 2015, the watchword was ambition. We need ambition, and so companies said, "Okay, let's be ambitious," and they created all these goals: is 2025, 2030, 40, 50 goals, or in 2060 in a few cases. And they were ambitious around net zero and however that was defined at the time. It turns out this is hard stuff. And it's not a solo sport. You need to engage your entire value chain, and not to mention the Wall Street and the cost of doing this, and then you get into the incredibly complex world of measurements and reporting and offsets and carbon sinks, and what's real and verifiable versus what's not. It's not surprising that this companies started to throw up their hands a little bit, and not completely at all. But companies are now saying, well, maybe we won't get to our 2030 goal until 2035, or maybe we'll only get to 80% of our 2040 or 2050 goal. And some people look at that and say, oh, it's failing, this is terrible. It's obviously companies, and it's just turned out to be far, far unbelievably more complex than most companies realized. And it's still complex. Nothing's really simplified. The complexity of offsets, the complexity of carbon removal, the complexity of all the standards that are, of which there are many, and the different reporting styles of what companies say, and the different kinds of commitments. Are you doing this with or without offsets, and how are they verified, and on and on and on and on. This is really, you're talking about fundamental changes in how companies operate, with not fundamental budgets, without fundamental leadership, without fundamental government support, and without fundamental market approval, really, particularly in the B2B space, in B2B and B2C for that matter. So this has been really hard stuff. And I don't think, when the current political administration came along and said, this is a hoax, this is all the different things they said, I don't need to get into that. And companies were saying, why are we doing this? We're just getting spanked publicly. And they didn't stop doing it. They stopped, to the earlier point, stopped talking about it, but they recognized that we have to, if we're going to be transparent about this stuff, we have to acknowledge the fact that this has become a lot harder than we thought, and we have to pare back our goals. And companies do that all the time with product releases, with financial goals, with all kinds of things that don't get the kind of headlines that retreating a little bit on sustainability get. So it's just something we got to live with in this moment.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you've seen any good ways for companies to go about this when we're talking about missing targets. How should they talk about this without destroying trust? I know you mentioned this. These seem to grab headlines more than other targets companies might have.
Yeah,
and I know a lot of companies I work with. That's their question right away. Is they're so worried about setting a public target and then falling short, and what that means for them. Any thoughts on best ways for companies to approach how they communicate that?
It's such a big question, and it really depends on so many different factors. And I'm really not an expert on this. I have my colleague Jim Giles at Trellis Group, either written himself or has overseen the creation of this remarkable series called Chasing Net Zero, where they dive deep into really looking at some companies, GM, for example, General Motors. What do they commit to? How's it going? How is it really going? Not just how they say it's going. What are the obstacles, and where does that leave them? I'm so not the expert on that, so I don't have a great answer. But again, it really depends on each individual company, its exposure, to just say its footprint environmentally, its competitive set. How much is this? Do you have to do this because the competitors are, or how much do you have to do this because society is saying, like with data centers right now and energy and water, that's not a nice to do. And carbon is certainly comes along for the ride and all of that. So I'm evading the answer here because I don't have one. And it really is so dependent on each individual situation.
Yep. And speaking of data centers, I wanted to touch on AI and sustainability. Trellis has been covering AI in sustainability reporting and the kind of broader paradox of AI. Wondering if you think, is AI more likely to accelerate sustainability work or kind of increase the environmental pressure, related to energy use and water demand and those types of things? Obviously, there's a trade-off here, but what are your thoughts on that dynamic of advancing sustainability while increasing environmental impacts?
Yeah, I think in the short term, the impacts are going to increase. In the long term, that the benefits, the supercharging of the sustainability will outweigh those problems. We ignore those problems of energy, water, waste, toxics, land use, noise, e-waste. We ignore those at our peril, just as we ignore the much bigger societal problems with AI. But it's not to overlook. We shouldn't overlook, what AI does so well and better than anything, head and shoulders, is help us make sense of vast amounts of data that's continuously coming out. Whether it's the grid or material flows or city operations, or so many things that frankly all the things that we've been dealing with in sustainability, which are incredibly complex systems. AI can make sense of that. It can help optimize that. It can become predictive and in ways that we've never even remotely been able to do. I believe that it's going to have a huge lead to a huge acceleration of sustainability solutions, and we have these challenges we have to deal with, for which there are solutions on the energy side, on the water side. They exist. The enemy of the barrier to that is, as it is for sustainability in general, is change. Change is hard for individuals, for institutions, for markets. I always say that when it comes to change, we love the noun and hate the verb. We love the idea of change, but actually changing is hard. And to the extent we even like the verb, we like it in the second and third person. But you need to change, they need to change. I'm doing okay. And so, that's the big barrier here is how do we, because in data centers, companies have never been, punished for the builders of data centers, then the designers of data centers, and to some extent the operators have never been, punished for doing it the way they've always done it. And that means evaporative cooling, swamp coolers kind of thing, and grid powered and on and on. That's not sustainable. And we have these technologies. There, you can now have renewably powered or battery operated, zero water, zero net water, or waterless cooling technologies. That may have less noise because you don't have these big cooling fans going 24/7 in people's neighborhoods. And we still haven't dealt with e-waste yet. That's a big one because these GPUs these chips that are used to power AI have a life of, in some cases, 18 months. And there's millions of them in a data center. And so they have to be replaced, and the boards that contain the chips. And what happens after that? And so there's a lot of problems they have to deal with, but the solutions are largely out there. It's just overcoming change.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, Joel. We're going to jump into our final 5 questions here. Change the format a little bit. We used to ask the same questions, final 5 to everybody, but I have some different final 5 questions.
Okay,
here.
I don't know these questions you're going to ask, so I'll do my best.
Yeah, these are just kind of big picture reflections, quick response questions. First one, looking back over 25 or so years of GreenBiz Trellis covering sustainability, what do you think would have changed by now that has not changed enough?
Oh, there's so many answers to that. I mean, at a sort of mechanical level, a price on carbon would be huge. Deprioritizing the role of fossil fuels politically would have been huge. Helping consumers understand that this is about their health and well-being of themselves and their families and their communities, and not just about saving whales and redwood trees. So there's a lot of different pieces of that, but we don't have those do-overs. So that's just wishful thinking.
And same part of the first question, but what has changed more than you expected over that time frame?
I was going to say how much this has become mainstream in companies. It's actually changed more and less than I expected all at the same time. It's now part and parcel of every company of any size in across every sector. So it's there and embedded, but it's not. It's still marginalized. So that's I guess it's like so many things. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's a two-edged sword.
What do you think sustainability professionals need to let go of?
I think to some extent their egos, that they're not going to be held up as saviors, that they are embedded deep in the companies and are doing really important work for which they may never get credit, but they have to rely on, I hear, not surprising that a lot of sustainability professionals say, I don't do this for the glory, I do this for my kids. But I think, they have to let go of, I think that this is about doing the right thing. As much as doing the right thing is so critically important for all sorts of reasons in today's world, this is really about business success, however that's defined, usually financially. So I think they have to let go of that. The doing well by doing good. The doing good part is just sadly not resonating.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think they need to fight harder for?
Attention. They need to fight harder to, I hate this phrase, but it's still relevant. It's making that business case, which is to say, really aligning with the goals of the company in any given moment, and not just the financial goals, but the quality goals, the product innovation goals, the communication goals, the employee engagement goals, and really leaning in on that.
And if the next chapter of corporate sustainability is still unwritten, what should we make sure gets written into it?
Gets written into it. I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, the next chapter of sustainability. What do we think? What do you think that looks like, or what would you want it to look like that's maybe different from today?
Well, I want it to look like what I've always wanted it to look like, which is just so embedded and so much part of what everybody expects a company to be, that it becomes, as I said before, like quality or safety. We don't talk about it. We don't hear companies, except maybe in very few rare instances, talking about their safety records or their quality records. They just do this because they have to, because that's how you compete today. And so that's what I hope the next chapter will start to look. In some ways, sustainability will fade into the woodwork, into the fabric of companies, of operations, and the markets in general, and not be even seen as much of a thing. And it's just accepted.
Love it. Joel, thank you so much for your time here. Super valuable insights, and I know we all appreciate all the work that you do for this field, for this profession. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for making the world a better place.
Thank you, Josh, for what you do. And it's always a pleasure having these conversations.